I thought I knew the rules, until my friend's mom smiled at me in a way that made everything feel forbidden, and irresistible. It all began on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. I was at my friend's house, carrying a box of books he had left at my place for a study session. The moment I stepped through the doorway, I noticed her, my friend's mom. She was standing in the kitchen, casually arranging fresh flowers in a vase, the sunlight filtering through the window and catching the soft waves of her hair. There was something effortless about the way she moved, a quiet confidence that didn't demand attention but naturally drew it. She glanced up as I entered and gave me a small, amused smile. Her eyes crinkled at the corners in a way that made her look both approachable and a little mischievous. I felt my chest tighten, a mix of nervousness and fascination, as if I had just walked into a room where time moved differently. I cleared my throat, trying to sound casual as I set the box down, but I could feel my fingers brushing against the edge of the wood table, grounding myself. She tilted her head slightly, studying me as if weighing whether I was worth her attention. Then came the teasing remark, "You're too young to lie, but old enough to try." Her voice was calm, warm, and carried that playful lilt that immediately made me aware of the gap between our ages, and the subtle intrigue that came with it. I froze for a split second, trying to process the layered meaning, and ended up smiling awkwardly. I realized in that moment how aware I was of her presence, the gentle scent of her perfume, a soft mix of jasmine and something uniquely hers, lingering in the air around her. There was a rhythm to our first interaction. Her movements were fluid, natural, my reactions were clumsy, self-conscious. When she handed me a glass of water, our fingers brushed just slightly, enough that I noticed the warmth of her hand without her making any overt gesture. My heartbeat quickened in a quiet, disorienting way, the kind that comes from being close to someone you suddenly can't stop noticing. We exchanged small talk, but every word was layered with subtle tension. I noticed how she laughed lightly at my jokes, though not without a hint of knowing, like she understood more than I intended to reveal. Her presence was calming yet thrilling at the same time. Even the simple act of her adjusting a strand of hair behind her ear became mesmerizing, as if each tiny movement carried weight I wasn't prepared for. By the time I left that afternoon, I was acutely aware of a strange mix of admiration and curiosity. She had managed to make an ordinary visit feel charged with quiet significance. The age difference between us was obvious, but rather than creating distance, it added a layer of intrigue I couldn't shake. I found myself replaying her smirk and the way her eyes seemed to hold a secret as I walked back to my car, realizing that this encounter, though brief, was the first thread in a connection that was bound to unravel slowly, thoughtfully, and in a way that neither of us could ignore. A few days after that first encounter, I found myself back at my friend's house, ostensibly to help with some homework, but I knew I'd be running into his mom again. There was a subtle excitement mixed with nervous tension as I walked through the familiar doorway. She was in the living room this time, seated on a chair with a book resting lightly on her lap, the sunlight falling across her shoulders in a soft glow. I caught her glance immediately, her smile held the same teasing warmth as before, but this time it felt more intentional, like she was waiting to see how I'd respond. Our conversation began innocently enough. I tried to share a small exaggeration about a recent mishap at college, something meant to sound impressive. Before I could finish, she raised an eyebrow, her smirk barely holding back amusement. "You're too young to lie," she said lightly, her voice carrying that same melodic teasing quality. "But old enough to try." I felt my face heat up and stumbled over my words, aware of how quickly my own nervous energy made me self-conscious. Her eyes lingered on mine, sharp yet inviting, and I realized that the challenge in her words wasn't just playful, it was magnetic. The way she leaned slightly forward, the curve of her lips, the subtle tilting of her head, all made the moment feel charged without a single overt gesture. As we continued talking, the banter flowed naturally. I noticed how easily she read my reactions, catching the smallest tells, a shift in my posture, a quick intake of breath, a slight hesitation before I answered. I found myself consciously aware of the space between us, of the warmth radiating from her as she gestured with her hands while speaking. When she laughed at my clumsy attempt to defend my story, it was a soft, genuine sound, carrying a richness that made the room feel warmer, more intimate. Our interaction became a subtle dance. When she handed me a pen, our fingers brushed lightly, a fleeting touch that sent an unexpected shiver through me. I realized how sensitive I had become to the smallest gestures, the brush of her sleeve against my arm, the tilt of her chin as she listened, the way she occasionally caught my gaze and held it a beat too long. These details, so simple on the surface, created a quiet tension I could feel in my chest. By the end of the afternoon, I was aware that something had shifted. The playful teasing had created a connection that felt surprisingly personal, as if we had stumbled into a private understanding without saying it aloud. I left with a lingering sense of anticipation, thinking about the way she had observed me, smiled at me, and quietly reminded me that she was fully aware of her effect on me. This playful banter wasn't just fun, it was the first thread of a deeper, unspoken awareness between us. The age gap remained, yes, but instead of creating distance, it framed our interaction with a curious, almost magnetic tension. Each glance, each subtle smile, made me more conscious of her presence, and more aware of the slow-burn connection that was beginning to grow, one carefully layered joke, one fleeting touch, and one lingering look at a time. It wasn't long before our interactions became more than casual meetings. One evening, my friend had gone out, leaving me at the house to help with some organizing he had asked me to do. I found myself in the kitchen again, where she was quietly sorting through a stack of old photographs. The soft golden light from the lamp above cast gentle shadows across her features, highlighting the quiet confidence and subtle vulnerability she carried so naturally. She glanced up and smiled when she noticed me watching her, a smile that was warmer this time, less teasing and more inviting. "I didn't expect you to stick around this long," she said, her voice calm, soothing, but carrying that familiar undercurrent of curiosity. I shrugged, trying to sound casual, but I could feel the tension in my chest, the strange combination of comfort and alertness that seemed to settle whenever she was near. We sat together at the kitchen table, the photographs spread out between us. Each one sparked conversation, and slowly the topics drifted beyond trivial matters. She began telling stories from her own life, moments I had never expected to hear about her, moments that revealed both strength and vulnerability. I listened intently, realizing how rare it was to feel so present with someone who seemed to see you clearly, without judgment. As she spoke, I became acutely aware of small details, the gentle movement of her hands as she held a photo, the way her shoulders relaxed when she laughed, the soft cadence of her voice as she recounted something both funny and poignant. I noticed the warmth of her presence, subtle but tangible, and how it made the air between us feel almost charged with quiet electricity. When I offered a comment or observation, she responded thoughtfully, leaning slightly closer, her eyes holding mine just a moment longer than necessary. It was the kind of attention that made me hyper-aware of my own responses, my gestures, the shift of my weight, the slight acceleration of my heartbeat. In that quiet intimacy, our conversation became a kind of dance. Neither of us forced closeness, yet the distance between us felt measured, deliberate, and somehow meaningful. When she brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture felt heavy with unspoken significance. When our hands passed near each other over the table, there was a brief, electric moment where our fingers almost touched. It was enough to make me pause, my mind and body alert to her subtle signals. By the end of the evening, I realized that I was beginning to see her differently. She was no longer just my friend's mom, the slightly enigmatic presence in the house. She was someone layered and complex, confident yet quietly vulnerable, teasing yet deeply sincere. And I found myself drawn not just to her physical grace, but to the depth of her character, the way she carried herself, the warmth and insight she shared in small, unexpected ways. As I left that night, carrying my thoughts with me, I felt a quiet, persistent pull toward her. The playful banter of our previous meetings had evolved into something richer, curiosity, mutual awareness, and the slow, delicate beginnings of emotional intimacy. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but for me, it was unmistakable. The connection between us was growing, quietly but inevitably, building a foundation that would make every subsequent encounter feel charged with possibility. As our encounters became more frequent, I started noticing a subtle shift in how I felt around her. It wasn't just admiration or playful fascination anymore, it was something heavier, more complicated. I found myself analyzing every glance, every laugh, every small gesture, wondering whether I was imagining significance where there might be none. The more I was drawn to her, the more I became painfully aware of the lines I wasn't supposed to cross. One evening, I stayed behind at my friend's house to help with a project he had forgotten about. She was there, quietly tidying up, the soft glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. I watched her for a moment, trying to focus on organizing the papers in front of me, but it was impossible to ignore the warmth of her presence. There was a grace in how she moved, in the gentle way she reached for objects or shifted her weight, that made me acutely aware of her nearness. At the same time, my mind was crowded with conflicting thoughts. She was my friend's mother, someone I had grown up knowing from the edges of my life. And yet, the pull I felt toward her was undeniable. I caught myself hesitating before speaking, suddenly hyper-aware of the tone of my voice, the choice of words, even the way I positioned my body in her presence. Each glance I stole felt like a risk, each laugh I offered carried more weight than it should. She noticed, of course. Her eyes held a quiet awareness, observing without judgment. There was a softness in her expression, a patient curiosity, as if she understood the tension swirling inside me. When she moved closer to hand me a pen, our fingers brushed ever so slightly, sending a shiver up my arm. I flinched inwardly, feeling both embarrassed and exhilarated, acutely conscious of the unspoken boundaries that hovered between us. The room seemed to shrink around us. Every sound, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the rustle of papers, the faint creak of the wooden floorboards, was amplified in my mind. I became intensely aware of my own heartbeat, the way my palms grew clammy, the subtle quickening of my breath whenever she glanced my way. There was a magnetic pull in her nearness, a quiet tension that neither of us addressed outright, but both of us felt. And yet, I hesitated. I hesitated because of the social expectations, because of the age difference, because of my own uncertainty about whether I could navigate these emotions responsibly. I wanted to be close, to understand her, to share myself without holding back, but I was terrified of crossing lines, of making things awkward, or worse, causing harm. She, as always, seemed to sense my inner struggle. She offered a gentle smile, a calm tone in her voice, a slight tilt of her head that was both reassuring and teasing. It was her way of saying, without words, that she understood the conflict, that she didn't expect anything, yet she invited my presence fully. And in that delicate balance, I realized how much I longed for her attention, how much the slow burn of our connection had begun to occupy my thoughts. By the time I left that evening, the emotional tension felt almost tangible, a weight pressing gently against my chest. I was both drawn and hesitant, fascinated and conflicted, aware that the most compelling moments were often the ones we dared not act on immediately. And that tension, that delicate, simmering uncertainty, was precisely what made every subsequent encounter feel electric, meaningful, and impossible to forget. After the tension of the previous days, our next meeting felt different, less like a test, more like a natural progression. My friend had gone out for the evening, leaving me to help with a small home project. I was setting up a few items when I noticed her standing nearby, watching me with that familiar, knowing smile. There was a warmth in her gaze that immediately eased some of the tightness in my chest. She moved closer under the pretense of handing me a tool, and as our fingers brushed lightly, the sensation lingered longer than expected. It wasn't overtly romantic, but the subtle contact carried a quiet reassurance, as if she were silently saying, "I see you. You belong here, in this moment, with me." I felt a flicker of comfort mixed with the lingering thrill of proximity, a balance that had become intoxicating. As we worked together, our conversation shifted from casual instructions to more personal stories. She shared a memory from her younger days, a moment of vulnerability disguised in humor, and I found myself listening not just with curiosity but with genuine care. I responded as best I could, offering observations and reflections that were thoughtful and sincere. The exchange was natural yet meaningful, each word building a bridge of trust that felt surprisingly intimate. At one point, she paused to hand me a small cup of tea. Our hands touched briefly, and I could feel the warmth of her skin seeping into mine. I realized that these small gestures, passing a cup, adjusting a chair, guiding me through a tricky step, were carrying emotional weight far beyond their practical purpose. They were tiny threads weaving a connection between us, each one reinforcing a sense of safety, attentiveness, and mutual respect. I noticed details I hadn't before: the softness of her sweater against my fingers, the subtle scent of her perfume lingering in the air, the way her eyes softened when she laughed at my clumsy attempts. Every small act of care she offered made me aware of how deeply attuned she was to my presence, how skillfully she balanced teasing with tenderness. There was a quiet rhythm to our interaction, a delicate ebb and flow that allowed both comfort and tension to coexist. The emotional trust we were building didn't need to be spoken. When I hesitated on a step, unsure if I was doing it right, she didn't scold or correct. She simply guided me with a gentle touch on the shoulder, a reassuring glance, and a calm, measured word of encouragement. In that moment, I realized how much her confidence had a grounding effect on me, how much I craved her subtle approval and quiet companionship. By the end of the evening, the room felt lighter, warmer, as if the shared effort had created a private world just for us. I left with a sense of profound appreciation for the slow, deliberate way our connection was unfolding. The playful banter of earlier encounters had evolved into something richer: emotional closeness, mutual understanding, and the subtle thrill of being seen and accepted for exactly who I was. These small acts of care, these gentle touches and thoughtful gestures, were teaching me a new kind of intimacy, one that didn't need words or declarations, one that thrived in quiet presence and unspoken acknowledgement. And for the first time, I realized that the slow burn between us wasn't just a fleeting attraction, it was the beginning of a deeper emotional bond, delicate, deliberate, and entirely irresistible. The days leading up to that evening had been filled with small but intense moments that lingered in my thoughts, her laughter echoing softly in my mind, the gentle brush of her hand, the way she seemed to notice every little detail about me. I knew the tension between us had grown, subtle yet undeniable, and that tonight would feel different. My friend had gone out again, leaving the house quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of floorboards under our movements. She was sitting on the couch, a book open on her lap, though her eyes were more focused on me than the pages. I felt my chest tighten as I realized how aware I had become of her presence. Every shift in her posture, every tilt of her head, every small movement seemed amplified, charged with significance. We were working on a small task together, arranging a few things in the living room. Our hands brushed more frequently than usual, not by accident, but with an unspoken permission. Each fleeting touch sent a jolt of awareness through me, a quiet reminder of the tension simmering beneath our interactions. I noticed the subtle scent of her perfume, the soft warmth of her skin near mine, and the gentle cadence of her laughter as she teased me about my clumsiness. There was a moment when our eyes met across the room, and it felt as if time itself slowed. The playful teasing and quiet vulnerability that had defined our previous encounters crystallized into something more profound. Neither of us spoke, yet the room seemed to vibrate with unspoken words, desires we were not ready to name, emotions too complex to articulate. I could feel the magnetic pull between us, a silent acknowledgement of the connection that had been building slowly, deliberately, with every encounter. She moved slightly closer under the guise of reaching for an item on the shelf, and our proximity became almost electric. The space between us shrank, yet it was measured, respectful, and deliberate. I could feel my pulse quicken, a low hum of anticipation running through me, while she remained calm, aware, and quietly commanding in her presence. The way she observed me, without judgment, without pressure, made me want to be closer, to share more of myself, but I hesitated, conscious of the boundaries we had yet to define. Every gesture that evening carried weight. A laugh shared over a small joke, a fleeting brush of her fingers as she handed me something, the way her eyes lingered on mine just a beat too long, all of it created a tension that was both thrilling and profoundly intimate. It was a dance of closeness and restraint, desire and patience, building towards something that needed no words to exist. By the time the task was complete, I realized that the connection between us had reached its apex. The slow burn tension, the magnetic pull, the emotional vulnerability, the shared glances, was at its peak. I felt drawn to her in a way that was overwhelming yet comforting, thrilling yet safe. In that quiet, charged moment, I understood that the emotional intimacy we had built was more powerful than any words could convey. As I left that evening, the memory of her gaze and the subtle warmth of her presence lingered with me. The tension was still there, simmering just beneath the surface, but it had transformed into something richer, a profound understanding of each other, a slow-burning anticipation of what was yet to come, and an undeniable emotional bond that neither of us could ignore. After the quiet tension of our previous encounters, there came a moment where everything felt natural, like the culmination of months of subtle gestures, stolen glances, and shared understanding. It was a calm evening, the kind where the light softened through the windows and the house was wrapped in a gentle hum of stillness. My friend had gone out again, and I had lingered, half expecting the usual nervous awareness that always accompanied her presence. But tonight felt different, less like an unspoken challenge, more like a gentle acknowledgement of what had been growing between us. She was sitting on the couch, a soft blanket draped over her shoulders, a warm cup of tea resting in her hands. When she looked up and saw me, her smile held the same playful warmth, but there was an added softness, a quiet understanding that neither of us needed to spell out. My chest tightened in a familiar way, but it was steadier now, grounded by the emotional closeness we had built over weeks of small, deliberate moments. We settled into conversation easily, the kind that didn't need pretense or exaggeration. She asked about my plans for the upcoming week, and I found myself sharing more than usual, not just the surface details, but thoughts and feelings I usually kept to myself. She listened, attentive and patient, occasionally nodding or offering a gentle comment. Her eyes held mine in a way that made the world feel smaller, more intimate, and more private than it had ever felt before. At one point, she reached out, placing her hand lightly over mine as I gestured during a story. The touch was brief, almost incidental, yet it carried a weight that made my heart race. It wasn't a leap into romance, it was a bridge, a quiet affirmation of trust and shared understanding. The warmth of her hand, the softness of her fingers against mine, was grounding, comforting, and thrilling all at once. I realized then how far we had come from the tentative, playful teasing of our first meetings. We laughed, we shared memories, and we lingered over stories of our lives. There were no barriers now, no hesitations, just the steady rhythm of companionship and mutual care. The age gap, the social expectations, the initial uncertainty, all of it had been woven into a tapestry of connection that felt natural and deeply satisfying. As the evening drew to a close, she smiled at me, a slow, knowing smile that carried both warmth and quiet affection. I reached to hold her hand again, this time with more confidence, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she let our fingers intertwine briefly, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had passed between us. It was simple, unforced, and profoundly intimate, a culmination of the slow burn that had defined our story. When I finally stood to leave, there was a sense of peace, of completion, and of ongoing possibility. The tension that had simmered through our interactions had transformed into something richer, emotional intimacy, mutual respect, and a connection that neither of us needed to rush or explain. I walked out with the memory of her warmth, her smile, and the quiet steadiness of her presence lingering with me, a lasting impression that promised continued closeness and shared moments yet to come. The story closed not with a dramatic declaration, but with subtle, heartfelt resolution, an acknowledgement that the slow, deliberate unfolding of emotions, trust, and affection had created a bond that was both satisfying and enduring. The connection between us was complete, yet it held the gentle promise of more, a warm and human intimacy built on patience, care, and mutual understanding. If you enjoyed this slow burn age gap romance, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories. Share your thoughts below. Have you ever felt a connection that grew slowly, one look or gesture at a time? Your story might inspire our next video.